So a warm welcome to everyone to October Gathering. And I think we are the first session, which is the original is an illusion, reconstructing towards a mystical reality. And really privileged and honored today to have everyone joining us. And also Simon Soon, as well as Bliana Chirik, all the way from Belgrade. Hi. And of course, today is Bliana's birthday, so happy birthday again,
Happy
Bliana.
birthday!
And a big thank you for joining us despite this being your birthday. So it's a wonderful October gathering and a great way to start. And so today, it's going to be quite participatory. I know this is a frightening word, but it's meant to be fun, right? So just relax and be yourself and just join in the aspects of this workshop that will require you to kind of participate, right? So first of all, just introduce Simon, Bliana, and myself. So myself, my name is Eugene, and I work as a senior curator here at the National Gallery Singapore. I work on curatorial and research. And my main research interests include the histories of exhibitions in Southeast Asia, as well as artist collectives in the region. All right, so I think it's great in that sense for October Gathering to start with our kind of workshop today, because for Bliana, Simon, and myself, I realized that we actually got together way back in 2013. Right, so Bliana, I'm sure you remember, and actually Patrick was there, Patrick Flores was there, and Vera May, Simon, myself, and many others.
In New Zealand.
Yeah, we were in New Zealand, we were in Auckland in 2013, and we got together for, exactly, right, for a conference titled From a History of Exhibitions Towards a Future of Exhibition Making. And it focused on China and Southeast Asia. And of course, Bliana then further developed this conference as it moved also to the Rockban Art Museum in Shanghai in 2018. And I remember also 2019 and 2019, yes. And later on, a book was published with the same title, right, as well. So yeah, really wonderful. And I realized I've also been collaborating with Bliana on all these projects that I've just mentioned. So big thanks to Bliana for also involving me. And really wonderful to also have both Simon and Bliana back here in October Gathering, especially post-COVID. And I also remember being involved in another project actually a bit earlier in 2012 with Bliana. And this was a book, I'm sure you also remember, Institution for the Future. Right, and that was published by the Chinese Art Center in Manchester. That was in 2012. That was edited by Bliana and Sally Lai. And later on, we did this very strange project that I'm not sure any one of you remember. We worked on this timeline, and it was Bliana, myself, and Alex Hobby. And we kind of created a timeline to look at the kind of the art histories of the world by focusing on historical events, exhibitions, publications, and artistic activities that kind of form connections and intersections, creating new institutional forms. Right, so that was actually at the Yellow River Art Center at the Gilman Barracks. So that was a kind of quite an impromptu kind of collaboration that Bliana, myself, and Alex did. So yeah, so we do come a long way, and of course Bliana is an independent curator, right, and also the curator of the pavilion at the Republic of Serbia. So for this particular Venice Biennale, presenting Walking with Water Solo exhibition of Vladimir Nikolic. What I've always known Bliana and why we have been collaborating extensively through the years was really through our shared interest in exhibition histories. And when we were discussing about exhibition histories, it probably wasn't so trendy then, even in academia. So it was really nice to kind of have someone with the kind of shared interest in exhibition histories. And she published what I consider as a really seminal book and it was really on exhibitions in Shanghai. It's titled History in Making, Shanghai, 1979 to 2006. So it's a really important book because I think for the first time, it documented not only the histories of exhibitions in a particular city, but also included the layout of the artworks in each exhibition, including archival materials and also producing the texts in those exhibitions. So I think it was a really important exhibition. So currently, Biliana is pursuing a PhD at the Monash University, and she's developing a long-term project reflecting on the China's Belt and Road initiative, right? And she's also teaching courses at the China Academy of Art. Right. And over to Simon. I've also known Simon for a very, very long time. And Simon's a senior lecturer at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. I remember first meeting Simon in Kuala Lumpur. At that time, you were still working, I think, for Valentine, really?
Fresh out of uni.
Fresh out of uni, yeah. And that was the first time we got to know each other. And because Simon's research was really into kind of left-leaning organizations and collectives in Southeast Asia, so which was also my interest in the histories of artist collectives from the 1950s to the 70s. We then met up more, I suppose, when I was in Australia pursuing my PhD, and Simon came down from, you were in Sydney, and you came down to Melbourne, and then we did this very quick research into the Frank Sullivan archives at the University of Melbourne library.
That's right.
Yeah, and then we digitized it. And we had this strange kind of collaboration going, whereby he would pass me some parts of his archival digitized materials to me, so that he would not lose it completely should he lose his portable hard disk. So it's kind of like...
I was just telling Zen about it, and she said that you haven't handed anything to her yet. So you may...
oh, not
so
yet.
You need to start coordinating.
Pass the materials over. So it's a bit like blockchain but analog style. Yeah? So just you pass to more people so you don't kind of lose it completely. So of course Simon is also a member of the Malaysia Design Archive. All right, and of course, also curates many exhibitions and also is an artist.
I moonlight as one.
Okay, and also currently a research fellow at the Getty Research Institute. Okay, so next, I hope we're all warmed up. Somehow I certainly am. So next, I'm just going to share what is going to happen for the rest of the workshop today. Right, so first we are going to have a discussion and a conversation really between Biliana, Simon and myself. And we are really talking about issues concerning the study of exhibitions and its methodologies. And we'll talk about issues concerning the text, how do we reconstruct exhibitions in different ways, and what are the problematics of reconstructing exhibitions. Right, and we'll then take a short break, followed by the group activity, right? And so I encourage everybody to come for the group activity because it's really fun. It's titled Instructions for Jointly Initiated Experiences. And what we're going to do is we are going to pair up and we will kind of intervene into the exhibition itself that has been reconstructed, as you can see, right? And we'll kind of share more details about how we're going to do that. But the idea is to achieve, ultimately, a kind of a mental, meditative, mystical, jointly initiated experience of the exhibition. Right? We'll see if we can do that. Yeah, we were kind of interested, and we discussed previously about reconstructing exhibitions, and how do we study, right, exhibitions, and what are the methodologies that we can use to kind of study exhibitions. And Patrick Flores has also posed this question. Are the methodologies from art history sufficient or even useful in the study of exhibitions as materials that contain materials? This is really a quote from Patrick Flores. So exhibitions are very complex because it encompasses so many different aspects, whether it's temporal or spatial, also in terms of the very complex discourses that are produced from exhibitions, the reception of exhibitions, and the kind of materials that goes into exhibitions, right? The artworks. Right? It's not just the artworks, but also the very idea that exhibitions are also not static, and exhibitions are evolving and changing over time, even during the duration of the exhibition. Just take for example, certain works could have been taken down during the exhibition for whatever reasons, right? And that's not documented in the catalog, because the catalog might have been produced before these works were taken down. So this is just one example. So that there are always difficulties when it comes to studying exhibitions, even as a material. So I just wanted to kind of open up this discussion, and perhaps we can then kind of share some thoughts about ways in which we can study exhibitions.
Yeah. I think even in trying to put this model restaging together, we realized, despite of having 10 years of sort of like intermittent thinking about, towards a mystical reality, both of us still realize there's so many inconsistencies with the way we understand how the exhibition is supposed to look like, right?
Yes.
Over the past 2 days of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Right down to the very basic detail of where is the entrance to the exhibition. We were not exactly very clear because we couldn't see it clearly from the archival installation views that we have. But of course, Kanaga would know, because Kanaga would have seen the exhibition where the entrance is. So hopefully we got it correct. Yeah, but even things like this, and the entrance is important because it helps us to orientate the entire exhibition itself, right?
Yeah.
And also some of the issues concerning, for example,
The artifacts, the objects that were brought into the show, right? That were presented in the show. I think there were, the catalog itself doesn't fully document the extent of the exhibition, nor gives any idea or suggestion of what the layout of the exhibition was. In fact, even some of the reproduction of the objects that in the catalog itself is actually differ from photographs of the installation that was shot and that was kept in the archives.
Yeah.
And many of the artifacts that we subsequently found in the archive of Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka never made it to, were never inserted or included in the, the published catalog. So unless you sort of like do the archival work, you wouldn't sort of like know that these objects were part of the show.
So one example is really something I just discussed with John when he was coming in, was the chair, right? And John's comment was, "Oh, wasn't it a wooden chair?" Right? I said, "Yes, the wooden chair was the chair they used in the catalog, but it's a different chair, a much more simpler chair that looks like the one that we have selected, foldable chair in the exhibition itself, based on the photographs that we have seen." Right. So there are all these kind of differences. And since we're talking about text, maybe we can talk about how do we reconstruct exhibitions, or what's the relationship between the exhibitions and the text, right, the publication.
Inviting me over to join this workshop, sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of an interloper. I never really considered myself as having a very strong sort of interest in exhibition history, but of course, I think, and my approach has never been from like an exhibition history sort of perspective, but for some reason, somehow my works do deal with like the modern, and I'm one of the sort of like site in which we can sort of understand reception and the production and the display of modern art is the site of the exhibition itself, right? So what I've been doing, I think, when we are thinking about reconstructing an exhibition through textual reference, one of the things that's been preoccupying my mind is not so much to do with like contemporary exhibition, but I've been, I guess, drawing on some of the thinking of about exhibition history that I've principally sort of engaged with through towards a mystical reality, by also speculating whether there's a way that we can reconstruct even earlier exhibition, more historical sort of exhibitions. So I don't know if you want to show some of the slides that we've prepared.
Yes.
Some of you might know it, and I've been in discussion with a number of you that I'm currently working on the pre-war history of Yongman Sen, and of course, with the limitation that was imposed during the pandemic, what I have really access to were a lot of the digitized materials, the digitized writings. Yeah, we can start with this. So I've been, thanks to the good graces of the NUS Digital Gems Collection, I've been pouring through travel memoirs, for example, and surprisingly discovering quite a lot of interesting passages in these sort of like written records. And in fact, there's quite sort of like vivid descriptions. For example, in this travel memoir, written by a sort of like Chinese traveler into sort of Southeast Asia, he gave a very vivid sort of like description of the Mansen Art Gallery, talking about exactly what he saw in the gallery space itself, including the economics and the business model for the gallery, what it was sort of like, what the gallery was selling, what type of artworks, and how it was sort of positioned and hung in the studio itself. But building on this, then, what I was principally interested in finding out is, how can we then, draw on some of these records into thinking about, for example, historical exhibitions where no surviving photographic records of the exhibition exist, and of course no catalogs exist as well. One of the places we find very detailed and vivid descriptions of these exhibitions are surprisingly in newspapers. Now you would think that something like this would be extensively covered in Penang newspapers, but my search of Penang newspaper didn't sort of like yield very interesting sort of and detailed records of it. Turns out that it was in a KL newspaper that had a full page description, a detailed description that gives an account of what the exhibition was about, but also who participated in it, the types of sections that the exhibition had, how the exhibition was laid out, what kind of works were included in the exhibition, as well as a general sense of the structure and the layout of the exhibition space that would allow me to identify which building was the exhibition sort of like staged in. So eventually we found out it was a sort of, it was always listed as a Chinese high school, but we never knew where it was located in Penang. But using the sort of like written description of how the exhibition looked, and that it has a sort of like front courtyard in a sort of like U-shaped configuration, we managed to sort of like I managed to locate the building on Leaf Street, which today is a sort of like wine bar that you see on the screen there. Okay, this was entirely done, during the lockdown when my only access to Penang was through Google Street View, and with that kind of like information, we could even sort of like go into the layout of the exhibition itself, where the sculptures are sort of like placed in the courtyard area, and where the oil paintings were sort of like hung. And then also the second layer where the photography were displayed in, and this gives sort of like by sort of like sketching out how an exhibition, the exhibition strategies that was in place in the 1930s, what we were able to sort of like get a sense of how historically exhibitions were sort of like staged in this part of the world. I think it gives much more sort of like visual impact and a visual imagination of the exhibition itself, over and beyond simply recognizing that the 1936 exhibition is, an exhibition recorded simply as a one-liner in the timeline of Penang or Malayan art history, right? But over and beyond that, I think in the newspaper itself, what you're able to surprisingly get out of some of the articles in there are records of the cultural life of the city. So I think in the 1930s, for example, there are a lot of newspaper columnists who took a social science sort of approach and were providing data, recording like the different sort of like cultural activities or trade activities, what was going on in Penang and Singapore. And these would be often in sort of like column form, and from that you can sort of like extract the data. And because the business of staging an exhibition was not possible during the pandemic, what it did was turn to sort of like GIS mapping software, and try to sort of like use this sort of like software, mapping software, to visualize, for example, where all the hotels were located in Penang, and the tailors. There were also the hairdressing sort of like areas with different grades of hairdressers, and where they're sort of like placed in Penang, but more sort of cultural specific data, such as where the bookshops were located before the global financial crisis, along the breach, the middle street area of the Beach Street commercial thoroughfare in Penang, to how it subsequently moved to the Carnarvon Street and Kimberley Street sort of like area after the Second World War, after the financial sort of like slump, the economic, the Great Depression, sorry, that's what I was looking for. Then there are also sort of like data on, for example, the printers, where the printers are located in Penang, and also the photo studios before the slump, before the Great Depression, and after the Great Depression, where it's severe, many of the photo studios sort of like shuttered off. But doing this sort of like mapping of all this different types of like cultural institution and sort of like cultural sort of like ecosystem of Penang, sort of gives us I think it allows me to have a better understanding of not just the exhibition as a solitary institution that is existing independent of the larger sort of like cultural ecology of Penang. And I think maybe in thinking about sort of like exhibition history, maybe we can also start to look beyond the exhibition itself in thinking, especially in historical context, to understand how the exhibition is actually located and existed within a larger kind of like supporting cultural ecology. Perhaps that could help enrich our understanding of the exhibition history itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great kind of methodology to kind of use these newspaper articles to map out the broader kind of evolving kind of cultural context of the city itself. I'm wondering, in your use of newspaper articles, how about the reception of the exhibition? Because that is also how we think about using newspaper articles in terms of the reviews of the exhibition. And was that something you found in this particular case study?
In that sense, yes. For example, what I didn't have here, so I have here, for example, in reviewing the Ying Art exhibition that was taking place in April 1936, this columnist by the name of Nan Guo, a very fascinating guy who is a local correspondent of Nanyang Sampao, actually began reflecting on the history of exhibitions in Penang. And in the article itself, over and beyond just talking about the Ying Art exhibition and its cultural achievement of that time, he began to then recite what he remembered as the exhibition history of Penang going all the way back to 1925. And so in this sense, there are sort of like attempts, very, very early 1936 attempt to do exhibition history. So there are sort of like these moments of reflection and that you can learn about how people were receiving and understanding exhibition, how exhibition itself spurs the thinking of the medium sort of like history on its own terms.
Do you find any limitations in terms of these newspaper articles? For example, I'm just thinking, did it give you a sense of how the works relate to each other spatially in the exhibition? Did it relate the works in this way, like comparing the works?
Right, not so much. Clearly, these were written by journalists or newspapermen or people with sort of like literary sort of like affiliation, such as this Nan-Guo person, but they would not have that kind of like sensitivity. Like they would give you an sort of overview of what the works in specific sort of like sections of the exhibition, but not to the extent of being reflexive. So it's not historiographical or curatorial in that sense of the term, but it's really the beginning of some kind of like awareness that this is a new kind of like space where you're able to engage with and interact with works of art and think about works of art.
Piliana, just wondering from your experience of like researching, for example, into the exhibitions in Shanghai and elsewhere, is that a similar kind of do you, for example, think about using newspaper articles as what Simon has done, or what kind of materials do you or sources do you use?
Yes, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Eugene, for very personal introduction and not reading the bio. It's always nice to kind of situate our relationship within the art context. I'm sorry cannot be with you, but yes, I think there are some similarities, although within the book, I think it's an archive of artist organized exhibitions from 1979 to 2006. And I kind of landed on artist organized exhibitions because they were most fragile archives. So basically they were all in artists' hands. I mean, there was no library to look at or archive to kind of start from. So basically I created the archive. And one of my kind of working methodologies that I learned through doing is to really make oral interviews. I had the luck that most of the artists were alive and still there, so you could actually talk to them, make a drawing and understand how the space worked. Of course, memory is always subjective, so everybody remembers the way they wanted to remember it. So I think it's always very important to speak to a few of them to kind of really get an idea of how the exhibition really looked like, because many of the venues that these exhibitions, early exhibition happens, were non-conventional venue. Like the one that Simon just mentioned was the high school. In my case, there were cinema cafes, classrooms, and many places that physically as the buildings even don't exist anymore because we went to do that research. In terms of the text within a book, besides artist interviews and kind of trying to reconstruct the conditions of making these exhibitions through the conversation, I also did I did look at the newspaper scans and reviews, because that was the only place where those things will be reviewed, because there were not so many art magazines or like places where you can talk. They were mostly mainstream newspapers. So these exhibitions were highly criticized as a kind of a political, cultural pollution of of the society. So, for example, there was a guy who was alive when I was doing this archive, who worked for Bao, and then he basically made the very bad critique reviews on the early abstract exhibitions that happened in Shanghai in early 80s. And many artists were highly criticized. It's even lost their working jobs because participating in these exhibitions. But I think for me, it was really interesting through this text to understand the social political context of the time when this exhibition happens, because most of these shows happen in a kind of a semi-public settings, except maybe the first one in 1979. What I also try to do, as you mentioned, is to create the floor plans, because many exhibitions till maybe, let's say, mid-90s, they did not have a catalogs. I mean, or any kind of published material to kind of archive how exhibitions look like. So I would sit with artists and we would try to understand how did the space look like and to make the floor plans. And I think for me that was extremely important to understand this physicality of exhibition, because I think exhibitions are mental but also very physical experiences related to the space where this encounter happened. So for me, it was extremely important to try to somehow urgently preserve this, because without these people who were still alive, when I was interviewing them, they were in the late 70s, that I can work with them to pretend that and created this archive that were published in the book. So, and I really liked the gentleman. I heard on and off, but like he was talking about catalog and the publication of the related to exhibition. So I do think it's also important to kind of think to, because we always stick to the catalog as a kind of a object that comes with exhibition, but it's interesting to think that publication is a somehow extended object of exhibition. And what does that do to exhibition? There is a physical reality and the temporal reality. And myself, for example, being an active curator for, I don't even dare to say, but let's say less than 20 years, I, for example, a long time ago, stopped making catalogs because I don't think that they are not, at least from my perspective, not so effective ways of kind of preserving the world that exhibition tries to construct. So for every exhibition, I somehow try to look at the publication in a very specific context of that exhibition and think like, what that publication could do to the exhibition, and what is that closer relationship that could be entangled, because the book itself has a life of its own after the exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all three of us have adopted, oral histories as a method, interviewing artists. I remember Simon, when I was talking to Simon about making the model for the Towards the Mystical Reality exhibition, he had already spoken to Sulaiman, Redza, and there were also issues if certain things were kind of inaccurate, even in terms of remembering what happened.
I think we just have to be very sympathetic also. Increasingly, as I grow older, I realize, if you're trying to recall something that happened 40 years ago, and I'm trying to remember something that happened 10 years ago, it's already challenging. Trying to remember something that happened 40 years ago would have been an insurmountable obstacle, and we have to be sympathetic towards those moments. Right?
Memory.
But I also think it's that's the way it is, and I think we have to somehow acknowledge that our understanding of history will always be fragmented, right? What we are actually trying to do is to retain some of the pieces that we can preserve, but I do think that it's always very subjective and it will always stay very fragmented.
But I do believe we can be confrontational on some level. So the example is that with Sulaiman, what I did was that he insists that when we were trying to draw out the floor plan for this exhibition, he insisted that the shoes that you see here at the exhibition, the round pedestal at the far end of the gallery, was never part of the exhibition, and it was dead sure. I was betting his life on it. So what we did was that I went to the archives, found photographs of it, and show it to him and show him where it was positioned. And then he sort of said that he stood corrected. So there are, I think, corroborating, the oral history interviews with maybe surviving photographs. In this case, we're lucky because in the contemporary context, there are more photographs that exist. Those are the ways in which we might arrive at a more accurate understanding of what the exhibition used to be.
Yeah, and even when we conduct oral interviews, we could be conducting a wider range of artists or people who just we know when to see the exhibition. Right? I think it's about just doing more of these interviews to kind of get a better, more accurate sense of what happened. Piyadasa, I just wanted to go back to your point about the physical space for encounter, as you mentioned, and that's very important to you. So how do you kind of develop methodologies to deal with this, the very physical encounter of an exhibition that is no longer present, obviously, because it has already happened?
Yes, I think one of the things that I did for exhibition histories in Shanghai, I created the floor plans. I mean, for the early exhibitions, that was quite difficult because the spaces were not there. Very, very few spaces stayed where they were because city changed so much. And that, but I think artists, I'm very grateful that artists were really helpful, and we basically did a project trying to find these places and do the walks together around the city. That was later part of the exhibition. And another thing that I did on a few occasions is actually creating the models that similar to what you have done towards mystical reality exhibition. I think one of the first models I created within exhibition was for the exhibition in Times Museum that was titled One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, Us and an Institution, Us as Institution, looking at the notion of institutional critique and what does that mean in the places where there were no art institution to really kind of critique on, and or what art institution meant in a different local context. So on that occasion, and I did an exhibition had a presence, a very big presence of practices from Southeast Asia and China and former Eastern Europe, which I think is something that has been not researched or unpacked in terms of comparative research very, very often. But I did, for this occasion, work very closely with FX Persono to create a model of a new art movement exhibition and how did it look like back then, with a very detailed work placing and what kind of works they were. And I think on a recent exhibition, and this is still ongoing, Guangzhou Academy of Arts in China, when the pandemic and the lockdown just hit, started triennial that is trying to connect China with the rest of the Asia, with the focus maybe on Southeast Asia from my perspective. And I was, when the project started, I was in a lockdown in Melbourne and Chinese borders are still closed. So I really kind of tried to think, how can you do exhibitions in situations like this? And I really wanted to do something very physical. So I proposed the repetition. So we recreated the exhibition of, I think we do have some images if we can share while I'm speaking. We recreated the exhibition Spirit of Friendship that Zoe Bath and her colleagues, The Factory, created. And we translated the whole archive in Chinese, which I think somehow, being in a lockdown and having my own personal connections in regards to the region, I thought it's kind of ethical thing to actually do. And the photo that you've seen, maybe we can go to the next one, is actually model of the factory's space and how exhibition was presented in factory. Because of the space, our presentation was slightly different, of course, but we worked very closely with the team from factory to recreate this model, just really trying to be as physical as possible during this isolation that actually is still happening. Just trying to kind of think what are the other ways. And a small thing that we try to experiment with this exhibition is of thinking of way of how we can document the exhibition otherwise. I was very hands-on during install through Zoom, which was extremely exhausting, but I have invited few artists and curators colleagues who were in China to go and see the exhibition and to produce formats that will kind of try to the question was how you can describe physicality of the exhibition to someone who actually haven't seen it. So I invited Jess Pigeon, artist who recently moved to Shanghai from New York, and she basically created the color patterns. So I think it was very cloudy but very hot and humid, so there were only colors that she created that kind of respond to her experience of the exhibition at the moment she visited. I think it's a beautiful experiment. And another young curator that I invited created a text, which is text that is not really kind of a review of the exhibition, but trying to capture some of the struggles that exhibition was trying to look at, and relationship to her own struggle, trying to situate that with her own context. So there was also a tryout to kind of think how we can actually describe someone exhibition who haven't had a chance to visit it without really just giving the photos of the gallery space and things like that. And I think this is really for me a really interesting an important thing that I think we need to collectively as artists or curators to think further, because there are many other ways to kind of document exhibitions. Yes, this is the floor plan. Maybe we go back of the New Art Movement exhibition that we did in the captions are wrong, but that's okay. This is at the Times Museum, but yes, this is a New Art Movement exhibition that I worked closely with FX to Carsono to recreate. Yeah.
Yeah, and Piyadasa, in your way of kind of rethinking about exhibitions through kind of commissioning artists to revisit the archive and to create new work, as what you have been also kind of discussing with us. How do you find? In what ways do you find that productive in terms of what the artists do? Can you tell us a bit more about?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Eugene. Well, when I finished archiving of exhibitions in Shanghai, I have to say I did this 5 years with no funding support, because no one, when I started, was really interested in looking at these exhibitions. As you said, it wasn't a really kind of very popular thing to do at those times. And then after I finished, Asia Archive came in, and they helped translate and in conversations, because they were all done in Chinese, and to create the short videos for their own archive collection that I have donated. So, and being a active curator, when you finish the archival process of this kind, you start thinking, okay, this is now in some kind of drawer or a digital data of archive. So one day some researcher will be interested and maybe look at it, but my question always was like how you activate this archive that is really on micro level, archive that is on margins, to become a kind of active citation, citations from the margin towards how art histories are written, or how maybe exhibition histories are written. And I think this is always, I guess, collective effort and collective work that we cannot do alone. And I turned to artists. And I have, for this exhibition that you see in the slide, I finished the book, and I have invited a group of local artists. Some of them were participants of this early exhibition, very active ones, and international artists to actually look at this archive and with a question, how can you relate to this archive today? What does this archive mean to you? And can this archive be part of the active knowledge today? And before, many international artists that I reached before, they didn't really know anything about exhibition histories in Shanghai. So we've done a lot of work and meeting artists and actors of the local scene together in order to understand what is the adequate approach. So I do think through this kind of attempt, working with artists to activate these archives through new commissions, you do kind of allow this archive and the knowledge that is kept within this archival material to be activated without control of institution or my own curatorial control. So I do like, because then I do think that's very important, because the work becomes created and it travels around the world and it's shared in a very different ways and becomes more open to interpretation, different interpretations. So it has a life that no institution, no myself can really control. And I think that there is this beautiful and I think very important thing when you work with a very with archives from the margins to allow them to kind of spill into the world to using very different methodologies. And I do think that's crucial, because I think many of art histories are today still written citing white men from privileged positions who have like all the conditions to do research, etc. So for me, it's some kind of curatorial commitment over the decades to create these citations from the margins that through exhibition histories.
Yeah, thanks, Bliana. Actually, it's something we should think about. How do we activate our archives by through the process of commissioning artists. And I think that's also quite a very fascinating way of opening up the archives and how artists adopt different methodologies that perhaps art historians and curators don't normally adopt. So what are your thoughts about repetition as a way to kind of wrap up today's discussion?
Maybe just sort of like one-liner about it being repetition offering as the possibility of expanding and prolonging the interpretive depth of our understanding of the show. I think with each restaging, including this one, I think I've learned something new about the exhibition, and maybe it's not arriving at some sort of like a fixed understanding of it, but thinking about the exhibition really opens up an opportunity to also revisit the text. And as a 10,000 word manifesto, it doesn't only send out one single message, right? It's ripe for deconstruction each time we revisit and reread the text itself.
Thank you. And Biliana, how about you?
Yes, I think my project for the triennial in Guangzhou is called Repetitions as a Gesture Towards Deep Listening. So many artists in former Eastern Europe use repetition as a very important part of their practice that leads towards the new. So I do believe that this gesture of repeating, they allow us to reestablish connections and like relationalities that maybe towards like a one-time encounter will not be possible. So yes, so I do practice repetitions as an important part of my practice. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Liana. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Please join me to thank
Thank you.
both Liana and Simon.